At exactly 6:12 a.m., a strange cry echoed across the salt marshes of Aransas, Texas. Not a dog, not a coyote, something ancient, almost haunting. A 13-year-old boy pulled aside his curtain and froze. Outside, a towering white bird stood in the mist, its silhouette glowing in the early light, staring directly at him, as if it had chosen him. Its feathers shimmered like frost, but its eyes held something warmer, something broken. And in that moment, the boy didn't see a bird. He saw a question only he could answer. If you believe in the power of one person to make a difference, hit that subscribe button now. Every like helps us spread awareness about these incredible birds and the fight to save them. Join us on this journey, because together, we can protect our wildlife and inspire hope. Your support means the world, not just to us, but to every creature whose story we share. At that very moment, standing in the misty salt marshes of Aransas, Texas, the boy's world shifted forever. He wasn't just looking at a bird. He was staring into the eyes of a living ghost, a creature teetering on the edge of extinction. Its tall, elegant neck swayed gently, but there was a silent urgency in its crimson eyes, like it was pleading for rescue from a danger only it could see. The cold morning air bit at his cheeks, but the boy didn't care. Time seemed to stretch as he watched the crane lift its wings and let out a low, haunting call that echoed over the reeds and water. It wasn't a cry for help he expected, but something deeper, a call to action that settled like a stone in his chest. He edged forward, heart pounding, every instinct telling him to run. But he stayed rooted, as if the bird's gaze had chained him to this moment. He felt an unspoken connection, a bond forming in silence between human and wild. This was no ordinary encounter. It was a summons. Then, just beyond the fog, he saw them. 3 more cranes, fragile and trembling, struggling to stand on shaky legs. Their feathers, once snowy white, were smudged with dirt and stained with battle scars from storms and predators. The boy's breath caught. These birds were survivors, but survivors in desperate need. He knelt in the damp grass, feeling the pulse of life in that quiet marsh. The crane's soft calls were like a fragile thread connecting him to a story much bigger than himself. A story of survival, hope, and a fight against time. He knew, without fully understanding how, that he was meant to be a part of that story. Turning back home, his feet slipped in the mud, but his resolve only hardened. This was no longer just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of a mission that would test every ounce of courage and compassion he had inside. The boy's backyard was small, just a patch of earth behind a weathered fence, but to him, it held the promise of sanctuary. That very afternoon, with hands trembling but determined, he set to work. He dragged old wooden planks from the shed and gathered torn blankets and broken fencing wire. Every scrap of material felt like a piece of hope. He hammered and nailed with clumsy precision, sweat mixing with dirt on his brow. Neighbors watched from a distance, some shaking their heads, others whispering doubts. "Why waste your time on those birds?" a voice called out, but the boy barely heard it. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but so was the lightness of purpose. Each day became a ritual. Before the sun even rose, he was outside, feeding the crane's fish he caught in the nearby creek, scattering grains he begged from the local market, and carefully refilling water troughs he fashioned from old containers. He learned quickly how to recognize signs of illness, how to protect the birds from sharp winds, how to calm their jittery nerves. His world narrowed to those birds, their fragile lives intertwining with his own. Schoolwork, friends, and even family concerns faded into the background. His parents worried, their voices tinged with both pride and fear. "Son, you're giving too much of yourself away," they said gently, but he only smiled, because he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The community, however, was less forgiving. Some called him obsessed. Others said he was chasing a foolish dream. "These birds don't belong in a backyard," a neighbor sneered. But the boy kept building, kept caring, kept hoping. Storms rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. Texas wind whipped through the marshes like a warning, and cold rain soaked the land and the boy's shelter. Yet, through every night spent shivering beside the birds, wrapped in a thin blanket, he never left. He whispered to them stories of courage, dreams of flight, and promises of safety. Slowly, the cranes began to trust. The largest, whom he quietly named Snow, allowed him near, even nuzzling his outstretched hand like a friend. The boy felt a profound joy, a breakthrough born of patience and love. One afternoon, he noticed Snow dancing with a smaller crane, a delicate pairing that filled his heart with hope. They were more than birds. They were a family beginning to form. And with that, the boy dreamed of new life, baby cranes, the next generation, a future worth fighting for. But danger lurked. Rumors of hunters patrolling the marshes spread through town. At night, the crack of distant gunshots shattered the stillness, sending a wave of fear through the boy's heart. He knew the battle to save these birds had only just begun. Reaching out to local wildlife rangers was a turning point. Some doubted his youthful zeal, cautioning him against risking too much. Others quietly admired his dedication and promised to watch over the sanctuary. Together, they crafted plans to protect the cranes, especially through the vulnerable breeding season. Despite threats and setbacks, the boy's resolve never faltered. Every challenge only strengthened his bond with the birds and his commitment to their survival. And somewhere deep within him, a spark of hope ignited. The hope that one day, these whooping cranes would soar again, thriving in the wilds of Texas and beyond. But saving the whooping cranes was only the beginning. What happened next tested the boy's courage like never before, and changed everything. The days grew shorter, and the winds of late fall swept cold across the marshes of Aransas. For the boy, the world outside his small backyard felt more uncertain than ever. But inside that tiny sanctuary, a fragile miracle was unfolding. Snow, the tall, graceful whooping crane, had paired with a smaller crane he named Willow. Their bond was unmistakable, two silhouettes against the golden marsh grasses, a silent dance of trust and companionship. The boy watched with a mixture of awe and hope as they grew closer, building nests and tending the fragile eggs hidden carefully among the reeds. But caring for the cranes was no easy task. The boy's life became a delicate balance of school, chores, and the relentless demands of his sanctuary. Each morning, long before the sun had risen, he was outside, braving the damp chill to prepare food and water for the birds. His hands grew calloused from handling the rough wood of the shelter and the weight of the feeding buckets. His body was often sore, his clothes perpetually damp from dew or rain. Yet, even in the hardest moments, the boy found strength in the cranes. They were no longer just animals to him. They were friends, teachers, and reminders that small acts of care could ripple into something greater. The boy's school days became a test of endurance. Teachers noticed his fatigue, his distracted gaze during lessons. His grades slipped, and his social life waned. Classmates whispered, calling him the bird boy, a nickname he accepted without bitterness. He knew what truly mattered. His parents struggled to find the right balance between supporting his passion and urging him to focus on his future. At times, they worried he was giving too much, losing himself in a dream that might never come true. But they also saw a fierce determination in his eyes that refused to be extinguished. The seasons turned harsh. Winter arrived with bitter winds and freezing nights. The boy wrapped himself in every blanket he owned, often sleeping beside the shelter, his breath visible in the cold air. He built small fires outside when he could, careful not to disturb the birds but desperate to keep warm. One night, a fierce storm rolled in. Thunder rattled the windows of his home, and rain pummeled the earth with relentless force. The boy stayed awake, flashlight in hand, checking on the cranes again and again. Snow and Willow huddled close, feathers soaked but spirits unbroken. The boy whispered promises through the storm. "I'll keep you safe. I won't let anything happen to you." But nature was only one of many threats. The boy soon realized that human dangers lurked closer than he imagined. Rumors spread through town like wildfire. Hunters had been seen near the marshes, their guns loaded and intentions unknown. One evening, while the boy was repairing the shelter after a windstorm, he heard a gunshot crack through the night. His heart stopped. The distant echo of another shot followed. Fear clawed at his throat. He knew the hunters were after the cranes, the very birds he had sworn to protect. Determined not to let fear paralyze him, the boy reached out once more to the local wildlife rangers. This time his plea was urgent. Rangers promised to patrol the area more frequently, but they warned him to stay vigilant and keep the birds hidden as best as he could. The boy took every precaution. He covered the shelter with tarps, scattered decoys to confuse poachers, and even stayed awake at night, listening for the faintest sound of footsteps. But exhaustion was relentless, and the weight of constant worry pressed down on him like never before. School became nearly impossible to manage. His teachers pleaded for him to focus on his studies. Friends invited him to games and parties he no longer had the energy to attend. Loneliness crept in, but the boy found solace in the crane's steady presence. Slowly, a small community of supporters began to emerge. A few neighbors, touched by his devotion, started leaving food donations. One elderly woman knitted warm blankets for the sanctuary. Even some classmates brought water and snacks without asking for recognition. Encouraged, the boy doubled down on his efforts. He read everything he could about whooping cranes, studies, conservation reports, stories of others who had fought to save endangered species. He learned about their migratory patterns, their mating dances, and the fragile balance of their ecosystem. But the greatest challenge was yet to come. One cold morning, as frost blanketed the marsh, the boy awoke to a terrible silence. The cranes were nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through him. He searched frantically, his breath ragged in the frosty air. Then, behind the shelter, he found it. Broken fencing, disturbed ground, and deep footprints leading into the trees. Hunters had been there. Despair and anger collided inside him. He knew he had to act, but he was only a boy, and the hunters were armed men. With trembling hands, he called the wildlife rangers. They arrived quickly, and together they tracked the footprints. The search was grueling. Hours passed with no sign of the cranes. Then, from the edge of a thicket, a soft, desperate call. Snow appeared, but limping badly, one wing bent awkwardly. Willow was nowhere to be found. The boy knelt beside Snow, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I won't let them take you," he whispered. Rangers helped tend the injured crane, and plans were made to transport Snow to a wildlife rehabilitation center. The boy watched, heart heavy but hopeful. In the following weeks, the boys' sanctuary became a rallying point. News spread through the town and local media about the courageous boy defending the whooping cranes. Fundraisers started and wildlife groups offered support. Slowly, the boy's sacrifice began to inspire others. Volunteers came to help with the sanctuary, donations poured in, and the community began to shift from skepticism to admiration. Through it all, the boy never stopped believing in the cranes. He studied their behaviors, documented their progress, and prepared for the day they would return, whole and thriving. The struggle was far from over. But the boy, once alone in his fight, now stood at the heart of a growing movement. A movement fueled by hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and the wild birds who had chosen him. With every obstacle pushing him to the edge, the boy faced a choice: give up or fight harder. What happened next would test his spirit in ways he never imagined. The days after Snow's injury felt like a blur of pain and hope, of sleepless nights and relentless determination. The boy's small backyard sanctuary, once a quiet refuge, had transformed into a battleground, not just for the cranes, but for a fragile dream that seemed to hang by a thread. Snow's wing was carefully bandaged by the wildlife rangers, but the road to recovery was long and uncertain. The boy spent hours sitting beside the injured bird, whispering stories and songs, his fingers trembling as he gently stroked its feathers. He could see the pain in Snow's eyes, but also a flicker of trust that gave him strength. Meanwhile, Willow's disappearance haunted him. The marshes were vast and wild, and despite countless searches, there was no sign of the smaller crane. Each unanswered question weighed heavily on the boy's heart, but he refused to give up hope. As winter deepened, the boy's world narrowed even further. Schoolwork became nearly impossible, friends drifted away, and exhaustion pressed down on him like a heavy cloak. Yet every morning, without fail, he rose early to tend to Snow and prepare food and water for the sanctuary. News of the boy's fight spread beyond his small town. Local newspapers ran stories about the boy and the endangered cranes, calling him a young hero with a heart bigger than anyone expected. Wildlife organizations reached out with advice, supplies, and offers to help. But with attention came scrutiny. Some questioned his methods, worried that a boy was risking too much with such fragile creatures. Others whispered that he was chasing an impossible dream, that the cranes were doomed no matter what. The boy faced those doubts with quiet determination. He knew the stakes were higher than ever. The cranes were not just birds. They were symbols of hope, of nature's resilience, and of the power of one person's love. One particularly cold morning, as frost glittered on the shelter roof, the boy received an urgent call from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Snow's condition had worsened overnight. There was a risk of permanent damage to the wing, which could mean Snow might never fly again. The boy's heart sank. Flight was everything to the cranes, their freedom, their survival. To imagine Snow grounded was almost unbearable. But the wildlife experts had a plan. A specially designed rehabilitation program with physical therapy, controlled environments, and constant monitoring. Snow would need months of care, but there was a chance. The boy threw himself into learning everything he could. He read medical reports, spoke with veterinarians, and even designed exercises to help Snow regain strength. Every victory, no matter how small, was celebrated. A wing stretched a little further, a step taken with more confidence. Meanwhile, the boy's sanctuary grew. Inspired by his dedication, neighbors and volunteers joined in. They helped build a larger enclosure, planted native grasses, and created safe feeding stations. The community's attitude shifted from skepticism to admiration, united by the boy's unwavering hope. But even as Snow's health improved, new challenges loomed. Hunters had not forgotten the marshes. Poaching remained a threat, and the boy knew that vigilance was crucial. With the rangers' help, they organized patrols and awareness campaigns. Flyers went up around town, and schools hosted talks about conservation and respect for wildlife. The boy became a spokesperson for the cranes, invited to speak at community centers and local events. His quiet passion and first-hand stories moved audiences, inspiring others to care and act. Then, one late spring morning, the boy's world shifted again. A distant, familiar call echoed across the marshes. the unmistakable sound of whooping cranes in flight. Heart pounding, the boy ran to the edge of the sanctuary, eyes scanning the sky. And there they were, snow now fully healed, soaring gracefully above, accompanied by a small flock of cranes. But among them was a sight that made the boy's breath catch. 2 tiny chicks, their feathers soft and downy, following close behind. Tears streamed down the boy's face. The cranes had returned, not just as survivors but as a family, a new generation born because of his love and sacrifice. The community gathered, witnessing this miracle. The boys' sanctuary had become more than a refuge. It was a symbol of hope and the power of one person's courage. From that day forward, the boy's mission grew. He continued to protect, advocate, and educate, knowing that the fight for survival was ongoing. But the sight of those whooping crane chicks, circling high in the Texas sky, reminded him, and everyone watching, that even in the darkest moments, hope could take flight. Just when hope seemed within reach, a new challenge threatened to undo everything, and the boys' fight for survival took a heart-stopping turn. The marshes of Aransas had witnessed something remarkable. A quiet revolution sparked by a boy's courage and a flock of whooping cranes that refused to disappear. What began as a lonely mission in a small backyard had grown into a beacon of hope that touched an entire community. The boy, now older and wiser, stood beneath the vast Texas sky, watching as the cranes danced their ancient, graceful rituals. The family he had nurtured, Snow, Willow, and their chicks, had become a symbol of survival and resilience. But the story was far from over. With the support of local wildlife organizations, the boy helped establish a formal sanctuary, one that stretched beyond his backyard to protect critical habitats across the region. Educational programs blossomed, teaching children and adults alike about the fragile balance of nature and the importance of stewardship. He became a passionate advocate for endangered species, speaking at conferences, schools, and town halls. His voice carried the weight of experience, blending youthful hope with the hard lessons learned through sacrifice and struggle. The community that once doubted him now stood united, rallying behind conservation efforts and celebrating every small victory. Fundraisers, awareness campaigns, and volunteer initiatives multiplied, creating a network of care and protection for the cranes and other vulnerable wildlife. But the boy, now a young man, never forgot the personal journey that had shaped him. The quiet mornings in the mist, the nights spent shivering beside injured birds, the fierce battles with hunters, and the unwavering hope that had fueled every step. His story inspired countless others to see the natural world not as something distant, but as a living, breathing connection that belongs to all of us. It reminded people that even the smallest voice can spark change, that compassion can overcome fear, and that hope, like the whooping crane's majestic flight, can soar beyond the darkest skies. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the marshlands, the young man smiled. Somewhere in the reeds, a whooping crane's soft call echoed, an ancient song of survival, friendship, and promise. And in that moment, the legacy of a boy and his birds was clear. A legacy not just of saving cranes, but of awakening hearts and igniting hope for generations to come.